This week, we welcome Brian Carey, Senior Advisory Services Consultant at Rapid7. In the Leadership and Communication segment, how to collaborate with people you don't like, 3 things to know before you land a tech job, all I want for Christmas, a CISO's wish list, and more. Business Security Weekly starts now.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we explore the business of security to improve the security of business. Your trusted source for actionable insights on leadership, communication, and innovation. Get ready for Business Security Weekly. Do you have a website, an external presence, employees, an office? Any of these things can be compromised and attacked. How are you defending your assets? Have you penetration tested your public assets? Start 2018 by taking a proactive approach to securing your vulnerable areas. Black Hills Information Security has been helping companies find their weaknesses since 2008. Email consulting at blackhillsinfosec.com and see how they can help you sleep better at night.
Welcome to Business Security Weekly. This is episode number 110, recorded December 10th, 2018. I am your host, Matt Alderman, here in Colorado, joined by my co-host, Paul Asadorian in G-Unit Studio in Rhode Island. Welcome, Paul.
Hey, Matt. How's it going?
Looks a little chilly in Rhode Island.
It is. You know, it was 23 degrees this morning, so that's kind of chilly. No? I mean, even for Colorado, that's chilly, right?
It's still chilly, yeah. I mean, my high yesterday, I think, was 38 degrees. So, yeah, it's a little chilly.
So I got the hat and the vest. I mean, you know.
Yeah, I know. I was just making sure that wasn't a Patriots hat.
No, it was not a good. I'm not even going to go back and watch the game. That's what people tell me. Don't bother.
Oh, lovely. I'm not watching the Broncos game either. All right. If you're interested in quantity or quality over quantity and have meaningful conversations instead of just a badge scan, join us April 1st to 3rd at Disney's Contemporary Resort for InfoSec World 2019, where you can connect and network with like-minded individuals in search of actionable information. Use the registration code OS19-SECWEEK for 15% off the main conference or World Pass. Also, check out our on-demand material. Some of our previously recorded webcasts are now available on demand at securityweekly.com/on-demand. All right. So our guest today is Brian Carey. He is the Senior Advisory Services Consultant at Rapid7, specializing in security program assessments, security program development, vulnerability management program development, security awareness, and policy development. If you want to learn more about Rapid7, you can visit rapid7.com/security weekly. Brian, welcome to Security Weekly.
Hey, Matt, thanks so much for having me. Glad to be here.
So as we prepared for this interview, the area we wanted to focus on today really was around kind of emerging trends and what's that impact to an organization's security program. So I'd like to start out and just kind of get a quick overview of what kind of trends are you seeing out there in the information security areas, things that our customers and viewers, need to be cognizant of?
Sure. So, 2018 it was an interesting year. It was sort of a positive and negative year from my standpoint, in the sense of, we finally start to see that upward curve of organizations really taking security seriously, starting to dedicate the resources and time that are required to stand up effective security programs, while at the same time we're still seeing a lot of organizations struggle with a lot of I think the same problems that have occurred over the last few years, and that's not only from from the standpoint of security teams sort of being overwhelmed, understaffed. It's a lot of organizations are still struggling with some of the basics, security foundational work that needs to get done in order to implement effective security programs. So, it's a little bit of a mixed bag, if you will. So again, I think we see some positive trends, but also a little bit of a Groundhog Day type of effect here, where we're starting to see a lot of the same issues kind of over and over again. So we're working hard trying to get organizations to understand what those foundational issues are, and help them to work to overcome those and work to success in 2019.
So give me an idea of what some of those foundational issues are. I think we know some of them, right? I think we know we've done basic, vulnerability discovery. We know we need to apply patches more timely. There's some basic stuff that we know we need to do. It sounds like we're still struggling with some of those. But what are some of those other foundational elements that, people should be really thinking about addressing, like right now?
Yeah, and it's interesting that you bring up vulnerability management, because that's certainly an area that we've seen a lot of focus on in the last few months. And I think from that standpoint, from a foundational standpoint, we still see organizations struggle with things like asset inventory as one prime example. We point back to, there's a reason why it's the first critical control. It's the reason why it serves sort of as the foundation for anything else related to your security program. And organizations still struggle with identifying what it is that they have in their environment. It's hard enough when we're talking about things like laptops and servers, things of those nature. Once we start expanding that discussion into potentially things like IoT devices and other devices that might be on the network, let alone data inventories and things of that nature, organizations really start to struggle when we move into those areas. So asset inventory is a big one from our standpoint. It's one of the first things that we talk about when we meet with any of our clients, is to make sure that they have a firm understanding of the assets and data that are in their environment, so they know what it is they need to protect, and where those assets kind of sit in their environment as well. So that's a huge factor from our standpoint. And vulnerability management is still very much in its infancy in a lot of organizations. We try to stress the importance of the fact that a vulnerability scanner, right, is just a tool. A vulnerability management tool does not make your program. And again, we try to talk about a lot of those foundational pieces, from just simply identifying what the governance model is going to be at your organization as well. A lot of these discussions don't happen, and we jump right into sort of, hey, what tool or what solution is out there to fix this particular sort of niche problem that I'm having, without really, taking a step back and saying, okay, let's take a deep breath here. Let's really look at our entire organization, figure it is what we've got, what our most important assets are, where our critical data resides, and then sort of building our protections around that.
Yeah, I'm a big advocate for vulnerability management, but not even, and as you mature, and I guess I've been working on the higher end of the maturity curve in security programs recently, having just done a series of interviews across multiple shows that talk about advanced malware and advanced persistence and backdoors, right? If you're not executing well on vulnerability and patch management, once an attacker gets inside your network, you don't want to make it easy for them, because if there's easily exploitable vulnerabilities, I mean, it's game over, right? There's no controls in place, or the controls are so easily bypassed that you're just in a losing situation from the start. And I think that's really something that I've learned this year, and kind of my I don't know, future prediction, but everything that I've observed underscores the importance that if you don't have a good vulnerability management and patch program, it's going to be a really bad day for you when an attacker gets in.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think one of the things that those of us in the industry have to be very aware of is sometimes we can get a little bit ahead of ourselves in terms of where we think organizations are today, just based on our own experiences, right? And we do need to take a step back ourselves as well sometimes and say, again, listen, to your point, right? We don't want to make this easy, and we're seeing, we don't even want to be worried about the next 0 day when we haven't effectively patched over the last year, and we're worried about
right.
Vulnerabilities that popped up a year or even sometimes 2 years ago, and organizations are not patching effectively against those. So again, what we try to do really is, again, take that step back, and sometimes we have to start at ground zero with a lot of our clients and get them to understand sort of the basics that make a successful program.
And I think also the point on inventory and assets in kind of looking at what's been happening over the past year or two, right? software inventory, I think, is becoming more and more important, right? Knowing what software is on there. If you're developing your own software, knowing the components is so important today. And I know Rapid7 has, application scanners, is getting more involved with the DevOps pipeline. It's an extension of your vulnerability management program, right? To understand the various components. The open source vulnerabilities that exist today greatly scare me, right? And the other thing that's similar to that is what my external footprint is and what attackers can see on the internet. We've seen the S3 breaches and all these other breaches that are basically, it was just a very simple missing control. It wasn't even related to a patch. It was a missing control. And so those are two of the trends that I think should be top of mind if you're running a security program today.
Yeah, again, and I think you're spot on. It's I think a lot of what we see in terms of the way exploits work is right. It's not focusing on maybe deeply technical configurations or things like that. It's looking for basic either misconfigurations or steps that folks have missed, or folks haven't done really their due diligence to make sure that all their security settings are set the way that they're supposed to be. And I think to your point as well, right? When we talk about asset inventory, right? I think people tend to get focused on hardware only. I think software is just as an important piece of that equation, and something that often gets overlooked. And that's not only from sort of a user endpoint perspective, but just again, what software exists in your environment? What are you doing to make sure that you're on the latest version, or you've got the latest updates or patches to all the applications that you run in your environment? And again, if you don't have your handle on it, how can you protect it properly? And again, that comes down to I think the pace at which a lot of organizations have to work to do implementations is very quick and very fast. And of course, what's the one thing that's going to suffer as a result of that? It's certainly the security of all those pieces. So I think you're spot on in that assessment. And again, that speaks to my point of let's take a deep breath here, step back for a minute. Let's get these foundational pieces in place, and then we can worry about some of these other larger issues that are coming our way.
I think one of the challenges I've seen over the past few years is we really kind of defocused on discovery and assessment, and really jumped to the security operations side and really went after response, incident response, building out the next generation security operations center. And I think we forgot about some of the basics on, look, if I had a good inventory and I knew where my critical assets were, and I knew the vulnerabilities that were there, and I was patching them effectively, then I could go do things like threat hunting and really do more advanced incident response handling capabilities. We almost lost focus there for a while, where I just see we dropped the ball on some of this other stuff. Where are you seeing trends on the security operations side, the SOC, incident response? I know Rapid7's doing a lot on that front as well, but how are those components coming together so that we're doing assessment, right? We're doing that discovery assessment, but then also tying that to the response side effectively.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point there, right? I mean, incident response is again another, I think, huge focus factor of late. It's something that our team has worked a lot on. We're seeing a lot of organizations that are very much focused on their response efforts and how they're managing security overall within their organization. Again, whether or not they do that from sort of an in-house staff SOC perspective, or they're outsourcing to a managed SOC. It's an area that we're seeing a lot of focus on. But I think your point is, again, very valid. Is when we talk about incident response, right, we have to think of a number of factors, right? So obviously, you need to have the policies, process, and staffing in place to deal with an incident when it comes up. But again, what it comes down to is if we know that we have an incident on a particular resource, or we're seeing a particular alert through a SOC that points to a very specific resource in our organization, we have trouble drawing the line between, okay, I know something is happening here, but what application or what system or what data is potentially at risk from this incident that we're seeing? And that's the correlation that I think a lot of organizations are having the hard time drawing. So we're getting better all the time at detecting potential incidents. I think we're trending in the right direction from that standpoint. But what we're really struggling on is, again, pointing that back internally and saying, okay, if I had an incident on a particular server or a particular network segment, and I'm seeing some unusual network traffic, okay, what systems or what data is potentially impacted here, so that I loop in the right folks from my team to deal with it. And it's that correlation that organizations struggle with, which is why, again, the asset inventory from a hardware and software perspective is so critical to make sure that we can, address any potential incidents as quickly as possible.
Yeah. So if I'm building a brand new security program for a customer, right? Kind of, where should they start? Kind of walk us through how you start to craft out a security program. Now, you may have one, but I'm trying to think through, where are those priorities when it comes to crafting your security program and those areas you need to start to focus on. Kind of give us some recommendations there.
Sure. So I think one of the common mistakes a lot of people make when they look at, like you said, either creating a security program from the ground floor, or again, you've got some, maybe you've got some governance or policy process in place and you've got some tools, but you don't really have the governance around it. I think the common mistake we make is not taking business context into the discussion, right? Sometimes we develop our security programs in somewhat of a vacuum, and we can always fall back on security best practice, and probably have an effective security program from that standpoint. But if we're not aligning with our businesses, in the long run, we're doomed to failure. So one of the first steps that we always recommend is getting that business context. So it's meeting with your senior business leaders, starting that discussion with the CEO, CFO, any of your other C-level or senior executives that are responsible for day-to-day operations of the business itself. What are their priorities? What are their goals? And making sure that any decision that we take is aligned with those decisions and goals. I like to always point back to doing a risk assessment, right? But we need to do a full enterprise risk assessment, figure out where the biggest challenges within the organization. Again, coming back to what is the most important elements for them. If you're a company that is a manufacturer, right? Maybe it's intellectual property that you're concerned about. If you are a retailer or in healthcare, right? PII might be of critical importance to you. So let's align with the business and let's get a governance model in place, right? A lot of times we do a lot of things in security that just operate independently of any type of governance. It's something we overlook a lot of. A lot of organizations overlook it. And they sort of implement tools and solutions in-house that, again, address a particular concern, but don't really operate under the larger umbrella of a security program. So everything that we do, every tool that we deploy into our environment, or every control that we implement, needs to come back and address a particular business goal from my perspective anyway. So, again, when we start, that's always how we start the conversation is, what are the goals here of your security program? Are they aligned with your business? And then how can we move forward effectively to achieve both of those?
Yeah, I think that's one of the big gaps that's missing, is that we don't realize security has to be aligned to the business. I used to give a talk years ago that used to talk about how do you create those mappings from a business objective, like, customer retention, down to what does that mean from a security control perspective. And I still think we struggle with that as an industry, really, to understand how the controls we implement in an environment ultimately have to support that higher level business goal. And so how do you kind of walk through that process with your clients? It'd be helpful to understand kind of how those linkages start to come together.
Yeah, so I mean, it really just comes down to, I think, discussions, right? A lot of times we make assumptions, right? We understand maybe what line of business an organization is in, and therefore we make some assumptions in terms of, okay, maybe I have an idea of what your business goal might be. Um, it really comes down to, for at least from our perspective, from the Rapid7 perspective, when we sit with clients, is we want to sit and get in front of and talk to all the individuals responsible from a business perspective in terms of what their goals are for any particular time frame. And I think the more we assume, like I said, if we look at something like a retailer, we can't assume that all retailers are the same. We can't assume that all healthcare providers are the same. We can't assume any of this. So what works for one might not work for the other. There might be different goals, different alignments within an organization. So we really need to sit down and get a sense from all the business stakeholders in terms of what's most important to them. I think even sometimes within an organization, those discussions aren't happening from a business perspective. So you've got different departments ultimately working for the same, working towards the same goal, but they haven't even had the discussions internally in terms of what's most important to them. Is it an application that they're developing? Is it customer data that they've got? What is sort of the one scenario which is going to cause you the most trouble, right? What are the end games that put you out of business, right? What are the scenarios that could potentially cause you the most disruption? Those are the conversations that have to be had. And once you, again, understand what those goals are, it becomes much easier to sort of put some controls around them as long as you can put it into business context.
Yeah, which always leads to the next challenge, which is, okay, I've identified where the priorities are. Now, how do you justify the budget and the resources to go implement those? So any recommendations on, how do you go get that budget? How do you go justify those resources? I mean, how do you help your clients with some of that communication? Because I think that's the next hurdle then for the security team, is getting the right budget, getting the right resources then to implement those new controls.
Yeah, that is certainly probably the hardest challenge. I have found it a successful path for a security team to get that done is to talk about this in terms of risk. So what is the risk to business data or business processes or business applications if a particular security control is not implemented? Now, that in and of itself is a hard challenge, because what we're trying to do now is convert sort of technical discussions into that business context and say, hey, we need this particular control. It's going to cost us X amount of money. And usually immediately everybody kind of gets hung up on the dollar amount of any particular control that needs to be implemented. But if what we can do is basically, again, put the risk into a business context and say, Mr. and Mrs. Senior Executive, here's the control that we're recommending. Here's the risk that we believe is mitigated if we implement this control. It is going to cost this amount of money. And that discussion is had. And if there is any kind of disagreement, or if there is the sense of, the business doesn't have the appetite to either make a spend or bring in an additional FTE to address a particular issue, we have to basically transfer risk. And I think that usually has a tendency to open up the most eyes, is to say, hey, business, it's okay. We're with you. We won't spend money on this particular control, but this risk is going to remain in our environment. And we would like you to sign off that you have reviewed our recommendations and are accepting the risk by not implementing a particular control. And usually folks tend to sort of stop dead in their tracks there and say, oh, wow, I have to assume this risk. And that tends to further the discussion and make that discussion about, again, do we have to spend a little bit of money? Do we have to make an investment in another area? A little bit easier to do. Because we as security professionals, I think, tend to make the mistake of assuming risk on behalf of the business. That's something I see over and over again, right? And it's not our job as security professionals to assume the risk for the business, right? In a lot of cases, we're just the caretakers, potentially, of the data, the caretakers of making sure security controls are in place, and that risk needs to be transferred to the business owners. And once that happens, you suddenly find that cooperation is much better.
Yeah, it's one of those conversations where, if security takes on the assumption of risk and owns it, it's why we say no all the time, right? Because we know the potential consequences. And so if you think about us traditionally in that risk acceptance role that security owns all the risk, you wonder why we always say no all the time. But if you can actually have that conversation with the business lines and say, well, that's fine. If you want to take on this risk, go ahead, sign off here. We'll do whatever you want. It changes the conversation from security always being this group that says, no, 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 you can't do that, to say, yeah, you can do that, but here's the risk, sign off on the risk or transfer the risk, like cyber insurance or something like that. It completely changes the conversation, I think, for security professionals with the business folks. I think that's really important.
Yeah, it does. Again, I couldn't agree more with that. I think it's, it's obviously the running joke. I think it's something that everyone has heard in this industry at once before is we get labeled as the Department of No. And, I think that's a little bit of an unfair label, but it's also, I think, a result of us not doing our jobs and making sure that we transfer that risk and make sure that someone else assumes that on behalf of the business. Because again, we certainly shouldn't be.
I think that's changing too. I think it's in industry we've gotten better at not saying no and being more aligned with the business. I mean, that's a very general statement, but in my observation, I think that's gotten better.
And I would tend to agree. I think, right, it's probably a little bit of both, right? I think overall, from a security perspective, I mean, I'm happy to say I think a lot of things are sort of trending in the right direction. Everything is context. It's obviously depending upon the overall maturity of the organization that we meet with personally, what we see. So I think it probably depends upon the size of the organization, what your overall maturity is when we come in. But I think Paul, I think you're right on. I think we're seeing a trend in the right direction. Security teams understand a little bit better what their role is. The business is certainly waking up and understanding what their role is in the equation. So we're definitely moving in the right direction. There's still work to do.
Yeah, but it means we're actually having the conversations between security and the business lines, and we're starting to try to understand risk and what does that mean from a security control and budget and resource perspective, where before we may not have been having those conversations. So I think the communication has definitely helped. I think the last piece that's important here that I also want your thoughts on, Brian, is the board, right? The board now is much more engaged and understands security more. And so now we're seeing, CISOs and senior executives, in the board meetings, having these conversations. What are you seeing there? What kind of recommendations do you have there for, senior levels that have to communicate things like metrics and overall risk posture back up to the board?
Yeah, so I think that observation is spot on. I think first of all, it's a good trend in the right direction that we're seeing the board level involvement and the board interest. I think that's something that's changed over the last year and a half. We're seeing boards be far more engaged in security, and I think a lot of that has to do with how much we see security just sort of in the news and in life in general, right? In years past or in months past, you wouldn't see much of an emphasis on anything sort of security related, whether it be just in sort of mainstream news or media. We're seeing that more and more now. And I think boards are sort of getting wise to it. And obviously, the more we see high profile breaches, companies sort of find themselves in the news now and having to answer questions around the security of their organization. Boards are taking a much more proactive approach in asking questions. So I think, probably one of the most common ways that interaction happens is, someone from the board reads something about, a latest vulnerability or something in the news, and they want to know, hey, are we protected from this, right? Is our organization at risk? Maybe it's of a particular vulnerability, or hey, could this breach happen to us? So I think, CIOs, CISOs need to be prepared to answer those types of questions. Are we at risk for X, Y, or Z, whatever that might be? So how do we do that? What are the things that we need to start reporting, up to the board? And I think a lot of that has to do with vulnerability management is certainly a big area. right? How are we at effectively patching our environment, knowing what our vulnerabilities exist? And in turn, that cascades down the line into things we talked about at the beginning of this, right? Until we have asset inventory and some amount of sort of secure configurations around that, we're not going to be able to accurately report anything beyond that. So if we get those foundational pieces in place, let's start thinking about what kind of information that we can report up. So what I like to do is say, like, let's start from that vulnerability management perspective. What kind of KPIs can we deliver up to the board, right? What kind of vulnerabilities are we seeing? How quick are we patching them? What does our sort of patching cycle look like from a time perspective? And I think those are probably the best ways to sort of at least be prepared for those board questions, because they're going to come. And again, it'll usually be in response to something that a board member has seen in the news, and they just want to make sure that they're not going to be the next one to have to deal and answer these questions.
Yeah. Is there an opportunity for us to flip that on its head a little bit? Instead of waiting for the board to ask us, well, are we susceptible to X, Y, or Z? How do we actually get ahead of it and say, based on these metrics, the board already knows the answer? How close are we to being able to do that?
Yeah, again, I think it comes down to organization to organization. I think a lot of the organizations that we see would probably struggle to be proactive in that particular area. And I think, again, it comes down to the struggle that's real with some of these basic foundational pieces. I think the way that we pivot from that, and the way that we can definitely be a little bit more proactive, is, again, let's get a handle and make sure that what we are telling the board is accurate. Because what we have a tendency to see is, the board asks a question, we want to give an answer, and sometimes we give that answer without really having done the due diligence and real understanding of our environment to make sure that what we're telling them is 100% accurate. So again, I would pivot back to saying, like, again, let's focus on these foundational elements of your program. You'll be in a far better position to not only answer the questions that come down from the board, but basically being able to proactively tell the board, hey, listen, we've done X, Y, and Z, and maybe it's something like going through the process of removing administrative, access from many of the users in your environment, right? Something as simple as that can mitigate a lot of risk that your organization might see. So being able to just report and say, hey, we've done this. Here's the reason that we've done it. Here's some of the things we're likely to mitigate as a result, I think can only improve your standing with the board.
Agreed. Paul, you have any more questions for Brian?
No, I'm good. I think it was good content. I like it.
Awesome. Brian, thanks for joining us on Business Security Weekly.
Thanks, Brian.
Appreciate it very much, guys. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. If anyone wants to learn more about Rapid7's advisory services or need help with their security program, please visit rapid7.com/security weekly. We'll take a quick break and then cover the leadership and communications articles for this week.